For several decades, scholars have rightly stressed that the history of Italian Renaissance art and architecture is characterized by both continuity and change. That is, during the early modern period, patrons and artists transformed visual vocabularies and styles, but the fundamentally medieval meanings and functions of many objects, spaces, and images remained largely unaltered. Nowhere is this more evident than in the religious art of the period in general, and, more specifically, that associated with saints' cults and relics, a topic that has long been the principal focus of my research. This comparison provides an example of such continuity and change. It shows two frescoes that commemorate the 1589 translation of the relics of the sainted Florentine Archbishop Antoninus Pierozzi on the right, and a late medieval manuscript folio on the left, which shows the invention and translation of St. Hedwig's relics. Stylistically, they're different, but in terms of their iconography and the rituals they depict, they have a great deal in common. Over the years, my study of the visual culture of relic cults, such as that of St. Antoninus, who is buried in this late 16th century chapel, has led me to explore Renaissance religion on a variety of levels. I have taken into special consideration the secular patrons and clergy who carefully shaped sacred sites and objects to promote themselves, the religious orders with which they were affiliated, as well as the effectiveness of saintly intercessors. I've also been particularly interested in religion as a lived phenomenon, one practiced by people from a variety of social classes who approach their faith and the cult of saints as a means to influence positively events as varied as the conception and birth of a child, a long journey, or a drought. The faithful encountered the objects of their religious devotions within fixed sacred environments, like the St. Antoninus Chapel, and here it is again, or as transient events, such as relic processions like the one depicted in Gentile Bellini's famous painting seen here. What I've discovered along the way is that the history of Renaissance religion, as it relates to sacred sites and objects, often is reduced to discussions of institutional competition. That is, it's presented predominantly in terms of the success or failure, or as a continual jockeying for primacy, power, and revenue from pious pilgrims. This approach, however, tends to obscure the more subtle realities of the nature and landscape of early modern religion. For example, I've been able to disprove the long-standing notion that the cult of St. Antoninus, whose first chapel is seen on the right side of this painting, was a sacred non-starter. His burial site did attract its fair share of devotees, particularly women concerned with fertility issues. In fact, the chapel held its own quite well in an intercessory niche market dominated by other sacred sites, such as the devotional juggernaut of the miraculous Annunciation image at Santissima Annunziata, located only a short distance from San Marco. I've also shown that, like many sacred commissions, St. Antoninus' present chapel was carefully designed to maintain and stress long-standing visual traditions and practices. Key elements of its design and liturgical function linked Antoninus to his episcopal predecessor, the early Christian bishop St. Zenobius, and to the St. Zenobius Chapel at Florence Cathedral, which you see at right. It is these qualities of interconnectedness, multivalency, and non-exclusivity that, perhaps more than any others, have defined my approach to the study of Renaissance religion, an approach that has drawn me in particular to Robert Manura's nuanced examinations of pilgrimage to Marian cult sites. By focusing on the image cult of the Madonna delle Carceri at Giuliano da Stangalo's eponymous church on the left, and the relic cult of the Sacro Cingolo, centered on the chapel at Prato Cathedral on the right, Manura has demonstrated that these sites were interdependent parts of an established devotional network, rather than localized and fragmented ones that perpetually competed for devotees. I find especially compelling his proposal that, quote, devotional inclusivity is not incompatible with institutional rivalry, end quote. In other words, Manura maintains that, although certain shrines and pilgrimage churches did vie with each other for pilgrim traffic, this competition existed primarily at the administrative level and did not necessarily affect popular devotions, which, more often than not, were directed at both holy sites as well as others beyond them, and one might argue in the home as well, or objects. This morning, I would like to delve further and chronologically later into these rather large issues of continuity and change and interconnected multivalency, using Giorgio Vasari's renovation of the Church of the Pieve in his hometown of Arezzo, and, to a lesser extent, his contemporary work at Arezzo Cathedral as case studies. The literature on Vasari's interventions in those churches rarely ventures beyond discussions of the rivalry that existed between them, considerations of them as products of counter-Reformation sensibilities, and their general dismissal as relatively minor preludes to the better-known Medici-sponsored renovations he carried out in the Florentine mendicant basilicas of Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce. Taking on Vasari's Aretine projects gives me an opportunity to address a question that has been nagging me for the past several years. How revisionary was the Catholic Reformation when it came to saints' shrines, chapels, and relics? Within the past 10 years or so, scholars such as Govan Bailey and Douglas Dow have rightly questioned the degree to which the Council of Trent and Catholic Reformation transformed late 16th century art. Like Bailey and Dow, I see little evidence of a new piety or an increased interest in saints' cults and relics in the period. Instead, keeping mindful of Manura's model of interdependent devotional networks, we shall see that, more than anything, Vasari treated Arezzo's two most prestigious churches and the relics they housed as complementary units in a cohesive sacred landscape that was far more firmly grounded in Aretine sacred tradition and religiosity than it was in a climate of institutional reformation. First, a bit of background information is in order. In 1554, Vasari developed a plan to renovate the cathedral's east end at the request of the Bishop of Arezzo, his friend Bernardetto Minerbetti. Vasari's program included demolishing the tramezzo, or rood screen, that divided the church so as to provide an unobstructed view during Mass of the elevation of the host. Removing the tramezzo allowed Vasari to relocate the high altar, which is part of this elaborate shrine containing the body of Arezzo's patron saint, Donato, so as to accommodate the choir in the polygonal apse behind it. Due to protestations on the part of the cathedral's conservative clergy, 10 years passed before the renovation was completed. In the meantime, Vasari undertook another, more extensive project at the prestigious Romanesque church of the Pieve. He may have replaced the Pieve's original open timber roof, which you see in the reconstruction on the right, with barrel vaults in the nave and side aisles, but this remains uncertain. What is clear is that he widened some existing windows and opened new ones in the basilica's east end. As he had planned to do at the cathedral, Vasari eliminated the tramezzo that bisected the Pieve's nave and moved the choir, which had been located in front of the high altar, into the apse behind it. By his own account, the latter modification vastly improved the acoustics in the church and provided more room for the faithful in the nave, as well as a clear view of the elevation of the host during Mass, which the laity had previously struggled to see over the tramezzo and a music stand. Due to a radical restoration of the Pieve during the second half of the 19th century, no trace survives of Vasari's architectural modifications or of his other contributions to the church. The latter includes several altarpieces that have never been adequately considered as they relate to each other, much less to Vasari's reconfiguration of the Pieve or his contemporary work at the cathedral. Vasari himself tells us that the Florentine Filippo Salviati commissioned him to execute one of the paintings in question, this Coronation of the Virgin, for the Dominican nunnery of San Vincenzo here in Prato. For reasons that remain unclear, the picture was never installed at San Vincenzo, and in 1570, Vasari's brother Pietro sold it to the Aretine jurist Nerozzo Albergotti, who had it placed on the Albergotti family altar located at the end of the Pieve's left aisle. That altar had long been dedicated to the Tuscan virgin martyr, Saint Mustiola, and in 1559, Vasari himself had been granted patronage rights to it. Rights he relinquished the following year to build this new high altar for the Pieve that also served as his family funerary chapel. Vasari's death in 1574 prevented him from completing a fourth painting that was to decorate an altar he had built at the end of the Pieve's right aisle. That altar belonged to the Fraternità dei Laici, a charitable confraternity whose members transferred Vasari's commission to Federico Barocci, who executed this Madonna del Popolo, now at the Uffizi. Had Vasari completed his painting for the Fraternità, the three altars would have constituted a cohesive Vasarian decorative ensemble in the Pieve's east end. Appropriate for a church dedicated to the Virgin's bodily assumption into heaven, the Albergotti and Fraternità altars had Marian subjects. A small oval panel depicting the Assumption and a marble statue of the Virgin constitute the entirety of the Marian imagery on Vasari's high altar. Instead, its iconography is more closely related to its function as a Vasari family funerary monument and as the chapel that housed the Pieve's most important relics. The Albergotti altar likewise was a combined family and relic chapel, and it is the relationship between it, the Pieve's high altar, and related altars in Arezzo Cathedral on which I would like to focus for the remainder of my talk, always keeping in mind what the connections they share can tell us about how religion and its history were framed during the Renaissance. Vasari's Albergotti and high altar pieces remained in situ until the Pieve's 19th century renovation, at which time they were relocated to Arezzo's Badia di Sante Flore e Lucilla. Today, the high altar stands in the Badia's east end, and the Albergotti altarpiece is located on the counter facade to the immediate right of the church's entrance. The former has altars at the front and back and is decorated with 26 panel paintings depicting saints, narratives of their lives, virtues, and Eucharistic themes. A majority of those paintings have onomastic and patronal connections to Vasari, his family, and the city of Arezzo. For example, Vasari's name saint, George, appears on the altar's back in Giovanni Stradano's St. George Killing the Dragon, and twice on the front, in a predella panel depicting one of his miracles, and standing to the right of St. Paul. The latter figure of St. George finds a complement on the far left of the altar in the image of St. Donato, who was, as the beleaguered little beast under his left foot indicates, likewise a dragon slayer. And I really like this. Okay, can you see? I'm assuming there's a laser pointer here. Oh, well. No, there's not. Okay, but George has a little dragon, too, over in his corner. Each of them has their little pet there. All right, where was I? Okay. This iconography also cleverly referenced Vasari's coat of arms, which appears on the shield St. George holds, and that includes images of two dragons that face each other. Vasari originally painted the altar's central panel depicting Christ calling Saints Peter and Andrew in 1553 for Pope Julius III, but, after waiting years to be compensated for his work, reclaimed it in 1560 and had it sent to Arezzo, where it was showcased on his altar. The Vasari altar was built over a crypt, which you can see in this late 18th century cross-section of the Pieve. Hopefully you can make it out. You're looking at the altar from the side, and then the crypt is a little chamber underneath. The crypt contained an altar to which the Pieve's most important relics were translated on the Feast of the Annunciation in 1564. This door in the altar's right side provided access to the crypt. It is situated below portraits of Vasari and his wife in the guises of an unidentified male saint and Mary Magdalene. The relics kept in the crypt included the head of St. Donato, which is contained in this 14th century reliquary bust. The head reliquary is displayed each year on 6 August, the eve of Donato's feast. On that occasion, it probably was placed on the Pieve's high altar, where it would have provided a three-dimensional complement to the similarly mitred but bearded image of the saint on the far left of Vasari's altar. St. Donato also appears on the left side of the Albergotti altarpiece. There, the Aretine patron is one of a series of images of predominantly female saints that frame the central panel and have onomastic connections to members of Nerozzo Albergotti's family or depict saints who traditionally had been venerated at the Pieve. Donato's presence in the painting's frame probably has everything to do with the fact that, in November 1570, a large marble casket purportedly containing his remains was found inside the St. Mustiola altar. Vasari's correspondence signals his interest in the discovery of St. Donato's relics at the Pieve, an event that immediately sparked a conflict with Arezzo Cathedral, which had long claimed to possess Donato's body. In the eyes of the cathedral clergy, the discovery at the Pieve of the relic casket with Donato's name on it threatened to undermine the sacred integrity of the Arca of St. Donato as the sole repository of the saint's headless body. It also marked the third time in more than 250 years that the two Aretine churches had clashed over the earthly remains of their city's patron saint. The first occurred in 1306, the second in 1486, and each time church officials ordered the Pieve to keep the controversial contents of the casket out of sight, permitting it to display only its prized relic of St. Donato's head on the eve of his feast day. Celebration of the saint's actual feast of 7 August took place at the cathedral and included the requisite liturgy and offerings from subject communities, Aretine civic officials, and others. Although the rediscovery of the St. Donato casket in 1570 led to a ruling that the Pieve was once again to hide it away, 3 years passed before this decision was handed down. In the interim, Vasari added St. Donato's figure to the Albergotti altarpiece's frame, effectively doing exactly what previous ecclesiastical rulings had prohibited the Pieve to do: acknowledge and promote the presence of the disputed relics within the St. Mustiola altar. But rather than seeing this as a subversive act, or one intended to promote the Pieve at the expense of the cathedral, I believe it was one of several ways in which Vasari sought to unify the two churches, not privilege one over the other. We've seen that between 1554 and 1564, Vasari eliminated the tramezzi, moved the high altars forward, and relocated the choirs to the apses behind the altars at both the Pieve and the cathedral. These types of reconfigurations traditionally and understandably have been closely associated with counter-Reformation tenets and treatises regarding sacred art and architecture. But, as Donald Cooper and others have shown, Reformation-era texts are remarkably vague on this subject, and, as Cooper states, quote, "The realignment of altar and choir in 16th century Italy was often dictated as much by custom and taste as by liturgical necessity or function," end quote. I agree, in that it appears that local and regional tradition impacted Vasari's work in Arezzo far more than reformatory rhetoric ever did. By establishing retrochoirs behind double-sided relic altars, he referenced an architectural and liturgical custom that was widespread throughout Tuscany and Umbria from the later Middle Ages. This tradition was associated with Franciscan churches in particular, and, to cite one of several examples that will be especially familiar to Itati people, could be seen at the Church of San Francesco in San Sepolcro, where the choir was located behind Sassetta's double-sided high altar that was located above a crypt that housed a saint's relics, the remains of the Blessed Ranieri Razzini, who died in 1304. The same features were present at the Pieve's high altar, and it is likely that Vasari viewed the one at San Sepolcro and other freestanding late medieval relic altars like it as particularly appropriate models for the two Aretine churches. In Arezzo, Vasari followed the Franciscans' example by creating a functional, iconographical, and patronal cohesion within and between churches. Not only did he remodel the east ends of the cathedral and Pieve in a similar manner, but for the high and Albergotti altars at the Pieve, he also borrowed the iconography of placing the figure of St. Donato to the left of a central image. He got this from Pietro Lorenzetti's Pieve Polyptych of the early 1320s, as well as the front of the altar shrine of St. Donato at the cathedral. That iconography marked both Vasari altars and the 14th century arca as repositories of Donato's relics. Furthermore, the arca, Lorenzetti altarpiece, and Vasari high altar are connected in that each has a small image of the Assumption of the Virgin above its central panel. The Albergotti altarpiece provides a variation on this theme in that it conflates the Assumption and the coronation of the Virgin. The Marian iconography in these works is unsurprising, but the reason for including a depiction of Christ calling Saints Peter and Andrew on the front of Vasari's altar has never been fully explored beyond Joan Stack's logical observation that Peter was the name saint of Vasari's brother, Pietro. I believe Vasari had an additional reason to install the painting he originally made for Julius III on his altar, in that it gave him an opportunity to create an additional iconographic bond between the Pieve and the cathedral, and to stress a local visual tradition of associating St. Donato with the apostles. To be specific, the present cathedral was begun in the late 13th century on the site of a medieval monastic church dedicated to St. Peter, and it bears a double dedication to the Prince of the Apostles and St. Donato. This explains why figures of the cathedral's two titular saints stand next to each other on the back of the St. Donato shrine. At the Pieve, Donato, Peter, and other apostles are juxtaposed once again in the Albergotti altarpiece, where the Aretine bishop saint stands to the left of a scene in which the apostles gather around Mary's flower-filled tomb, with St. Peter kneeling prominently in the painting's center foreground. Vasari made a further reference to Aretine church history on the Pieve's high altar, for the pairing of Saints Donato and Stephen may be explained by the fact that, until its demolition in 1561, Arezzo's first cathedral was dedicated to those saints, and, according to tradition, Donato himself was responsible for its construction. Instead of Stephen, the half-figure of the Blessed Pope Gregory X serves as a saintly pendant to St. Donato's image on the front of the cathedral shrine. Which leads us to another connection between the Pieve and the cathedral that, to the best of my knowledge, has not been noted. Gregory X died in Arezzo in 1276, and it did not take long for the Aretines to begin to venerate him as a patron saint. In addition to his prominent image on the front of the arca, the saintly pontiff, who also appears under a trefoil arch next to St. Paul on the shrine's back. The Blessed Gregory was also honored in the cathedral with this elevated wall tomb. Until the early 19th century, it stood against the left wall of the chapel dedicated to St. Sylvester, to the left of the high altar and choir, and I've sort of crudely reconstructed that here. It works, more or less. Giovanni Freni has shown that the cathedral's east end was conceived as an appropriate setting for the relics of Donato and Gregory. The St. Sylvester Chapel, in which the Blessed Gregory is still buried, belonged to the Albergotti, the same family that owned patronage rights to the St. Mustiola altar in the Pieve. I'm unaware of any corresponding images of the Blessed Gregory at the Pieve, but both there and at the cathedral, there were double-sided high altars that housed important relics of St. Donato that were flanked on the left by secondary relic chapels patronized by the Albergotti. The connections between the similarly configured east ends of each church would have been especially evident on the feast of St. Donato, which, we've seen, was celebrated at the Pieve on the Vigilia and then at the cathedral the following day. This decorative, ritual, and patronal cohesiveness belies an institutional history that, until now, scholars have addressed primarily in terms of institutional competition over Donato's relics or the demands of the Counter-Reformation. The art and architectural history of the sites tells us instead that between the two churches, Vasari stressed continuity and cohesion of ritual and iconographic tradition over reformatory change to create an interdependent local network of sacred history, family, and religiosity. What is missing from my analysis today is an understanding of how Vasari's projects may have been received by and filled the religious needs of the Aretine faithful, issues I look forward to exploring as I move ahead with this project. Thank you.